you everybody for joining us this beautiful November evening. First, I wanted to start off by thanking our sponsors, the Association of the Pittsburgh Priests. Today, we're going to be talking about the topic is the God who sees justice, compassion, and truth in the immigration conversation. We're going to be joined today by Karen Gonzalez, a speaker, writer, and immigration advocate. Today is Monday, November 6th, 2023.
Start by talking to you about one of my favorite people in the Bible, and that is this woman here. This is Ruth. You see there standing behind her mother-in-law, Naomi, and in the distance you can see another daughter-in-law of Naomi's, and that is Orpah. So I love this story because the first time I ever heard the words of Ruth that are really famous, I was looking at a picture that somebody had embroidered for a wedding, and there were these beautiful words. There was a bride and groom, there was a stained glass picture, and then, just in front of them said, "Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." And I thought those were such beautiful words about marriage. But then I read the book and I found out that these words are not about marriage at all. In fact, they're not even about a happy situation or a happy, a joyful celebration of any kind. These are words spoken by Ruth to her mother-in-law, Naomi, after they experience a series of devastating losses. They experience death, widowhood, infertility, abject poverty, an uncertain future, and finally, forced migration. So the context of these words is not the best of times, like a wedding celebration, but it's really the worst of times, more like a funeral. And in the biblical text, we learn that the story begins in Bethlehem. I think it's so ironic that the word Bethlehem means house of bread, but there's no bread in the house. It's gone. There's a famine in Bethlehem. And when people are hungry, they soon become economic migrants. They go off in search of food. And so Naomi and her husband Elimelech migrate to a neighboring country. It's a Gentile country named Moab. And there they find everything that they need, and things look good for a while, but only briefly, because soon enough, Elimelech dies. And that's bad. I mean, in the ancient world, a woman without a husband or a father is really in a dire situation. But things brighten up a tiny bit because she still has two young sons, and these young sons soon get married. And for 10 years, life goes on as before. But then disaster strikes, and the two sons also die. Now, this is bad because all of this happens in the first 5 verses of chapter 1 of the book of Ruth. Now, in Israel, there were certain laws that were supposed to protect widows and other people who lived on the margins, but those laws weren't always followed. And we can assume that Moab probably didn't have any of those laws at all. So now we have three widows. And three widows is triple trouble in the ancient world. It's triple trouble because these are extremely vulnerable women. It's not like they can go find a high-powered career. They depended on the men in their family to take care of them. And so now the three of them are left with nothing. But there is one bit of good news. Naomi hears that there's bread once more in Bethlehem. So she tells her daughters-in-law, you know what? Let's go. The famine is over. Let's go back to my home country, my hometown. And so they set off on the journey. And you get the sense that they're on the journey. And all of a sudden, Naomi turns around and says, you know what? Don't come. It's better that you stay in your own country and that you remarry among your own people. And what's interesting is the text doesn't tell you why. We don't know why Naomi suddenly changes her mind. Sometimes I wonder if she thought, well, I have to take care of myself and now I have two additional mouths to feed. Maybe the sense of responsibility was too much for her. Maybe she remembered what it was like to live as an immigrant in Moab. And she thought, well, that might be a really hard life for my daughters-in-law, just like it was for me. The text doesn't really tell us, but I have a feeling that the reason she decides that they should stay behind is she might have remembered something that was in the book of Deuteronomy. And it's this verse right here. This verse that says, Ammonites and Moabites can't belong to the Lord's assembly. Not even the 10th generation of such people can belong to the Lord's assembly. There was a lot of strife between Moab and Judah, where Bethlehem was. And Moabites are part of Abraham's extended family, but they're descended through the incestuous union of Lot and his daughters, if you remember that story from Genesis. In fact, Israel's hatred for their Moabite cousins can be seen in this verse. They're excluded from the Lord's assembly for 10 generations and beyond. Whatever Naomi's reason, she convinces Orpah, her daughter-in-law, to go back home. Orpah seems to be the more sensible of the two, and she decides to stay behind. But Ruth is undeterred. She speaks those famous words of love and loyalty, and she sticks with Naomi, come what may. I like to imagine what it must have been like that day when they trudged into Bethlehem together. It must have been such a sad scene, these two widows shuffling in together with nothing. Things hadn't been great that day that Naomi had to leave because of the famine in Bethlehem, but at least she'd had her husband, at least she'd had her young sons. Now she has nothing, nothing except this equally sad looking woman that she has to take care of in her hometown. Now, the only bright spot is they do arrive at the beginning of the barley harvest. And this is a really good thing because there's another note in Deuteronomy that's really important and which might explain Naomi's decision to move exactly at that time. The scripture says, whenever you are reaping the harvest of your field and you leave some grain in the field, don't go back and get it. Let it go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows, so that the Lord your God blesses you in all that you do. Similarly, when you beat the olives off your olive trees, don't go back over them twice. Let the leftovers go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows. Again, when you pick the grapes of your vineyard, don't pick them over twice. Let the leftovers go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows. This is from a Common English Bible, which uses the words immigrant instead of stranger, which really means something different in our time. Now, what I love about this verse, which is a verse I've read sometimes in Deuteronomy and just skip right over, but what I've learned to really, really love about it is that in the story of Ruth, we find this command carried out. I want you to think of all the stories in the Bible that you can think of, and there's always people disobeying, people coming into judgment, exile, but not in this book. In this book, people do exactly what God's law commands. So you have these two penniless widows who arrive, one who is an immigrant, not just from an immigrant community nearby, but from a hated community, a despised community. And they arrive in the society of Judah. And this immigrant woman, Ruth, she's welcomed into the field of Boaz. And in this field, she gets to glean, just as the verses say, she gets to glean what the harvesters have left behind. Boaz seems to understand something important, that even an immigrant is entitled to a decent job with a decent living. And the work that Ruth performs is not undignified. It's not demeaning work. In our time, immigrants do the work the rest of us don't want to do. But the work that Ruth does, though it's hard work, it's exactly the kind of work that everyone did in the ancient world. Boaz acts with great generosity. He was actually not free to act in any other way because we have these verses right here that tell you exactly how you're supposed to act toward the immigrants, the orphans, the widows, the poor in the community. He wasn't free to be anything but generous, not if he was a follower of the God of Israel. It was God's law that guaranteed Ruth this place, cleaning the crops. And all of the people on the margins, not just her, had the right to simply walk onto a field and begin to work for their livelihood. And Boaz has an obligation not to order his workers to harvest everything for his own economic gain. They couldn't harvest what grew in the corners, nor what they missed the first time around, because compassion for the poor was more important than efficiency, and it was more important than profit. So this woman, Ruth, she finds a place among the people of Israel, and she's able to not only take care of herself, but she's able to take care of her mother-in-law. And then together they build this new life in Bethlehem. And her mother-in-law positions her in such a way as to broker a marriage for her and for Boaz. And so at the end of the story, something very beautiful happens. At the end of the story, Ruth has married Boaz and she has a child. This woman who'd been barren for 10 years now has this child. And Naomi is holding this child. And the women say something to her that I want you to remember because it's a really important thing to hear in the Bible, especially in the Hebrew Bible. The women say to her, your daughter-in-law who loves you is better than 7 sons. Now, that may not mean a lot to us today, but in the ancient world, women weren't considered people. Never mind this foreign woman, hated, unclean community. But Ruth is loved and welcomed and becomes a blessing to this community. And in turn, this community becomes a blessing to her. What you see in this story is what some people have called the Blessed Alliance, where men and women, citizen and non-citizen, people from different ethnic groups come together for the flourishing of their communities. And all the people in the story become their best selves. It's a really, really beautiful story, and it has such a joyful ending. We know that this child that Ruth bears, this child is mentioned again in the book of Matthew, because this child is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. So I want to talk about something that I've heard here. This is a quote from a Somali poet who says, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And what you see here in the picture, these are some statues that are on the coast of Marseille, where a lot of North African immigrants come through into Europe. And it shows you a little bit of what it's like to be a migrant. It's a very striking picture because just like Ruth, most immigrants have not sat around dreaming of leaving their home countries. In fact, when we leave pieces of ourselves behind, just like you see in this picture. We leave our home, we leave our comfort, we leave our heart language. Often we leave extended family behind, and we have to leave our sense of self behind, and we have to start all over again, almost like children in a new country. It's a very painful and traumatic experience. And some people never recover, they never adjust to life in a new country. But people embark on this journey for three primary reasons. Okay. These are the primary reasons that people migrate, especially to the US. Number one is to work, that is to improve their economic situation. Number two is to reunite families. So maybe dad came a long time ago by himself, and mom and the kids stayed behind in the home country, and now they want to bring the family together. And the third reason is to flee persecution and violence. These are the top three reasons. Now, are there some people that come seeking adventure or opportunities? Yes, of course. There's your Justin Bieber's, people like that. But the majority of people, this is why they're migrating. Now, I want to define some terms that we hear a lot. I was just in the Arizona and Mexico border, and I got to visit Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Mexico. And I heard a lot of terms, especially around asylee or asylum seeker and refugee. So, what I want to tell you is that the definition is exactly the same. Asylees and refugees flee due to persecution or fear of persecution for their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. That is the only reasons. I read this great essay when I was doing research for my book that called Ruth a refugee. But if you look at the reasons that you see right here, you'll see that she's not a refugee. She's not fleeing due to persecution for her race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. She's fleeing to keep the family together and due to famine. So she's what we would call an economic immigrant or a family-based immigrant. Now, membership in a particular social group is a little bit confusing to people, but let me tell you some of the social groups that our government recognizes. Women in the Middle East and North Africa who are at risk for female genital mutilation. They are a social group. Members of the LGBTQ community in Ghana, where it's a capital crime to belong to the LGBTQ community. So that is considered a social group as well. Educated women in Saudi Arabia are another social group. So another social group that people are advocating for is people who are fleeing due to gang violence. And so a lot of people that are coming from Central America, for example, are fleeing due to gang violence. So many people are arguing that that is also social group. The only thing that differentiates a refugee and an asylum seeker is where they apply for their status. Refugees have to flee to, so for example, a Syrian refugee flees to Jordan, which is a nearby country. From that country, they're in a refugee camp. They connect with the UN Refugee Agency and they apply for refugee status. They receive it and then they're sent to Canada or the United States or the UK, wherever countries that participate in the refugee program. Asylum seekers, on the other hand, our law says, our US law says they have to either be in the US when they apply or they have to present themselves at a port of entry. So for example, I'm an asylum seeker. I walk all the way from Guatemala, where I live, and I come all the way to the borderlands, right to Tijuana, right to the border there with San Diego. And I would turn myself in to the Border Patrol and I would say, I want to apply for asylum. So a lot of the people that are coming that you're hearing about, they're not coming to try to cross illegally. They're coming and turning themselves over to the Border Patrol in order to apply for asylum. That is their right under US law. So these are some of the terms. Let me go over a couple more. So an immigrant is just any person who leaves their home country. A refugee is a type of immigrant. An asylum seeker is a type of immigrant. But it's any person who leaves their home country and moves permanently to another country. I want you to know that only 4% of refugees are ever resettled. There's this sense that people have that the United States is taking in all the refugees. It's not true. Most Syrian refugees, for example, are in Turkey, they're in Lebanon, they're in Jordan. They're not in Europe or the US or Canada. The United States takes in a percentage of 1% of refugees, a very, very small number. The rest live in camps. Some camps have been open 20 years. They just closed a camp in Bhutan that was open for 24 years. So that's just a settlement at that point. Immigrants can also apply for asylum within 1 year of being admitted to the US. So I've seen cases like this, a young man who was from Cameroon, and while he was in the US studying, he found out that he had a kidney failure that required dialysis. And where he was from in his country, he was not going to be able to get access to dialysis. So he applied for asylum. But again, if you'll go back to the reasons you can get asylum, persecution for race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. He was not granted asylum. He ended up migrating to Canada. You can apply within 1 year being in the US. Less than 8% of asylum applications are successful. So you have the right to apply, but it doesn't mean that your application will be approved. It takes typically about 2 years for an application to be adjudicated. So that means you would be waiting during that time to hear on your asylum case. There's not enough federal judges to process these applications. And finally, I just want to offer a reminder that it's legal to apply for asylum. It's illegal to deny people that right, although it happens all the time in the borderlands. Now, what happens to people once they're in the US? Let's say they enter the US, whether legally or whether they're undocumented. So there was a study done by the Immigration Policy Center, and it revealed that immigrants are more likely to become victims of unreported crimes. The first one is wage theft. Second, assault and muggings. More likely to become victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, and more likely to become victims of human trafficking. Most of this is labor trafficking. They are also more likely to experience workforce inequities, being underpaid or working with no paid time off, to experience exploitation at work, and to experience a breakdown in family structures. So there's this irony that people come to keep their family together, but all the stresses of living here, particularly if you're undocumented, actually cause a breakdown in a family. Now, I want to talk about the particular vulnerabilities that women experience. There's a study done by Amnesty International that 70 to 80% of immigrant women crossing the border between the US and Mexico are sexually assaulted. In fact, there are groups in the borderlands who distribute birth control to women so they don't become pregnant from these assaults. And I never thought working in a legal office for immigration, I would meet on a daily basis women who've been assaulted, sometimes by other migrants, usually by human smugglers, and also sometimes by officials, who know that the women have very little recourse. So this is the real crisis in the borderlands, folks. The vulnerability of immigrant women and girls. Because immigrant women experience danger entering the US and poor conditions once they're in the US. So how did we get here? How did we get to a place where there's such a crisis in our borderlands? So I want to talk a little bit about some notable dates in immigration history here in the US. Just a few dates, don't worry. I'm as bored by history as a lot of people. But I think it's important to go over some of these because they speak a lot to where we are now. So the first law that we know of is the Chinese Exclusion Act. This law did exactly what it says. So many Chinese immigrants came and they helped build the railroad out west. And as soon as it was built, then there was all this anti-Chinese sentiment. There was believed that they lacked sufficient brain capacity and that they were unable to assimilate. And so this act came into place. And by the way, it wasn't repealed until 1943. So for a long time, this was on the books. There's a community in northern Mexico of Mexicans of Chinese descent. So what a lot of Chinese immigrants did is instead of going back to China, is they just fled south to Mexico. And so there's a community there, and you'll meet Guadalupe Wong and lots of people with Chinese surnames, but they're Mexicans now, right? They've been there for generations. So that's the first law in the books, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Next, we have the 1924 Immigrant Act. And this was where they started creating very strict quotas that are based on national origin. So this law became came into being around the same time as eugenics. And if you're familiar with eugenics, this is a junk science. It's not a science at all, but it was this very racist belief that there were certain races of people that were superior to others. And so part of this Immigration Act, part of the quotas, it said that criminality was inherent in the Italian race and that high rates of illiteracy among Italians were due to inherent racial tendencies. And so there was a quota for how many Italian immigrants could come. Now, if you were from Northern Europe, if you were from Scandinavia, if you were from England, Ireland, Germany, not a problem. You could come in. However, if you were from Southern Europe, Greek, Italians, or from Eastern Europe, so any of the Slavic peoples, these people were thought to be inferior and less capable of assimilation than the races that had come into America previously. So there were very, very strict quotas for them. So now we have in 1965 the Immigration and Nationality Act. This is the first law that is not based on race in any way. So Chinese Exclusion Act excluded the Chinese, the Immigration Act excluded Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans. But now this law for 1965 is only based on family connections and it's based on employability skills. So this is a really good thing. It coincided with the Civil Rights Act. I'm here. I'm a U.S. citizen today because of this law, because that is how my uncle, who was able to sponsor my dad, and my dad extended that sponsorship to us. Okay. Now we have in 1996 the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. I like to bring this up because one, it was a change that came in 1996. And a lot of people have a kind of misunderstanding about immigration. They think everybody who's a Democrat is very soft on immigration and everybody who's a Republican is very hard. But I want you to know that's not the case. Actually, Bill Clinton has been one of the most harmful presidents in terms of what happened to immigrants in this country. And one of them is this law right here. It was supposed to be a deterrent. So what it said is that if you were to have more 6 months or 6 months and one day more of illegal presence in the US and you were not admitted legally, then let's say I am in the US, I entered illegally, I've been here a year, and let's say I marry a US citizen. Now, most people would think, well, now she can adjust her status. But according to this law, I have to go back to my country for 10 years. And after those 10 years, I can then come back and apply and adjust my status. So this is a law, we call it the 3 and 10 year bar. If you have less than 6 months, it's a 3 year bar. More than 6 months, it's a 10 year bar. It's a lot of harm, a lot of mixed status families because of this law right here. And a lot of families have been separated because of it as well. So this is just some of the things that have happened that I'm sharing with you, a little bit of the highlights. And what you'll see is that a lot of the laws prior to 1965 had to do straight up racist. Straight up. They weren't even trying to, dog whistle it or cover it up. It was just very racist. Then we have this really good law that comes into play in 1965. And then in 1996, we take a step back. Okay. So I want to say that immigration is an economic issue, a social issue, and a political issue, but it's also a Christian biblical issue. And we know this because it deals with human beings. And human beings, the Bible says, are made in the image of God. So immigration, because it's about people, We don't say illegals, we don't say aliens, we say undocumented or unauthorized immigrants because no human being is illegal. We really dehumanize people when we call them aliens or illegals. So I just want to encourage you when you talk about immigration, it's important the words that we use that they be humanizing and dignifying. Now in the Bible, God has a really special concern for the immigrant. Ger, this is the Hebrew word that's closest to immigrant in English, appears 92 times in the Old Testament. Usually like this, the same law applies to the native born and to the immigrant living among you. You'll see in Exodus as well, and in the other books, the first five books of the Bible, you'll also see you must love the immigrant as yourself, for you were immigrants in Egypt. So God is reminding them, remember how you were mistreated in Egypt, and you must not do this. You must treat immigrants well. They must have the same rights and responsibilities as your citizens. So the scriptural witness is that we are to care for the immigrant stranger living among us without any caveat that exempts us from this responsibility if it's not in our economic interest. Now, often when I talk about immigration, I talk about it a lot. People will ask me about certain verses in the Bible, usually this one right here. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So usually people tell me, aren't people breaking the law? Doesn't the Bible say that we should be subject to the governing authorities? And so, what I say to people is it is important to take this verse into consideration. But it's also important to remember that US laws are not God's immutable laws. We have laws that changed or are repealed frequently. We have a whole branch of government devoted to legislation, to changing laws. It used to be legal to own people as slaves, to deny women the right to vote or own property. These were all things that were legal, that we recognized were wrong. And it was the Apostle Paul, right? St. Paul, who wrote these words, and he himself was executed by the Roman Empire because when Roman laws came into conflict with his faith, he chose his faith. He even spent a lot of the New Testament in prison, writing letters from prison. Now, I want to talk briefly about some of the myths about immigration, but instead of stating the myth, I'm just going to tell you fact. These are the facts. Immigrants today are not any different than the ones that came generations ago. We have the same need and we have the same humanity. We just didn't come on a boat across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, if immigrants are the same, what has changed? Well, federal immigration laws have changed. Now there are no lines to get into to immigrate lawfully. This leads to unlawful migration, and this leads to vulnerability and invisibility. That's what has changed. There are only 4 ways to enter the US legally. The best way to remember them are blood, sweat, tears, and luck. Blood, if you're a close relative, so family-based migration, very, very long waits. Sweat, there are very limited numbers of visas for highly educated people, usually, and they're sponsored by employers. Tears, a fraction of 1% of the world's refugees. People have to be fleeing persecution. And then luck. For some countries, there is something called the diversity visa lottery. Your odds are about 1 in 300, but some people are able to come in that way. These are the only ways. If you don't meet one of these criteria, there is no line for you to get into. But guess what? There are jobs for you to get. There's just no line for you to get into. It's like the border has two signs, it's one says help wanted and the other one says keep out. 55% of refugees to the US are Christians. I say this because there's a misunderstanding about who is classified as a refugee and who gets to come in. We take in most of the persecuted Christians around the world, the church in Palestine, the church in Egypt, the church in Iraq, these ancient churches, we take in most of those persecuted Christians into our country. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't admit people who aren't Christians, but this is just to correct the misunderstanding that exists. Somehow people have gotten the wrong impression about who is a refugee and why they're coming here. Another fact is that undocumented immigrants pay taxes, as much as $12 billion in taxes every single year. In fact, it's it's something that has been studied over and over again. And every time it comes out the same. Undocumented immigrants pay taxes. Usually they use fake social security cards, or the IRS will give them something called an individual tax identification number, which is especially for undocumented immigrants to pay taxes. The IRS has said on the record, we know people are undocumented. We want our money. So has Social Security. So why do you think the government has such a conflicting response to immigration? You have one part, the IRS and Social Security, accommodating payments, giving people numbers so they can file taxes. But you have another part, Homeland Security, that says that people shouldn't be here. I mean, if we really don't want people to be here, why doesn't our government have a consistent response? So immigrants create jobs. They also fill in the holes in our labor market at the high and low end of the job scale. Almost all economists say that immigration, and particularly illegal immigration, has benefited the US economy. Immigrants fill in the holes in the labor market, complementing the work that US citizens do. They also contribute as taxpayers, as consumers, as entrepreneurs. Another fact, immigrants bring strong family values, learn English, and integrate into our communities. As compared to native-born US citizens, Latino immigrants are more likely to attend church on a weekly basis and more likely to be married and less likely to get divorced. Now, whenever I say this, people are always saying, well, I know immigrants that don't speak English. This is true. Immigrants are striving to learn English. There's only certain immigrants that speak English well. So 23% first generation immigrants, because remember, people migrate as adults. It's very difficult to be working. It's also very difficult to learn a language when you're an adult and you don't have time to study because you're working. 88% of second generation immigrants speak English well, and 94% of third and later generations. So for most people, the struggle is not in learning English, but in 2 or 3 generations, their native language is going to be gone. Nobody's going to speak it. I see that even in my own family with my nieces. Immigrants have an excellent work ethic, and through our work, we support our social systems. So most immigrants to the US are in their prime working ages, and they are not eligible for public benefits. No immigrant would apply for a public benefit and risk getting on the radar of the US government to be deported. So we are 13% of the US population, but 16% of the workforce. And in the medical field, as you see here, 50% of biotechnology workers, 40% of medical scientists, 15% of nurses, 22% of nursing, psychiatric, and home health aides, and 28% of doctors and surgeons. Much of our food comes from the California Central Valley. 70 to 75% of those workers are undocumented immigrants. So I always tell people, migration always brings changes, and people like to complain about things like, oh, somebody doesn't speak English. They don't complain about the fact that they don't have to pay $10 for a tomato. Because in fact, that's something that immigrants bring. With the labor that immigrants do, we're able to have food that's more affordable than it would be. And immigrants are good neighbors. Historically, as immigration rates increase, crime decreases. This is not because we're better people. We're all just people. They've done actually studies on this. For over 100 years, they've done this study. Remember how I told you that they thought that Italians were prone to criminality? They started doing the study back in 1924, way back then. And they've done this research over and over again, most recently under President Trump. And there's no connection between immigration and higher rates of crime. Immigrants tend to be very good neighbors because we come here to work. So why are immigrants less likely to commit crimes? One is the threat of deportation. We're going to suffer more for criminal behavior, so we're less likely to break the law. The other is healthy immigrant thesis. We self-select for those who are willing to work. If you're not willing to work, you tend to not take on the journey because life here is going to be hard. And so only the people who want to work tend to be the people who come. And then, of course, there's also greater enforcement. And more interior enforcement is deporting a lot more unlawful immigrants. So, and this is my final slide, in short, immigration is good for countries and their economies. But even if it weren't, God commands us to welcome immigrants, to do justice for immigrants, and to love immigrants as we do ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you so, so much, Karen. I do a lot of the same work that you do in trying to share the knowledge that we have with others. I firmly believe that many people don't know what they don't know. And by sharing the information in the way that you share it, I am hoping that people learn something. And I'm hoping that the folks that are on the call today have learned something. I always say maybe, we have the choir present, but the choir always needs choir practice. So, and so I'm very grateful to you for sharing what you shared with us. Thank you. Right now, I would like to ask Sister Janice Vanderneck to offer a few minutes of reflection on the topic. Sister?
Hi, thank you, Monica. Thank you, Karen. Excellent presentation, Karen. And like Monica, I do give presentations of this nature to many groups. And I'm always very grateful for the opportunity to put out the information that is correct and that comes from working directly with the folks, as opposed to what they hear on the media or on certain news channels, and of course in the political forum. We started Casa San Jose specifically to assist in the Pittsburgh area with the numbers of Latino immigrants that were undocumented and who needed tremendous accompaniment in order to be able to situate themselves in Pittsburgh and raise their families there while living with the barriers that are insurmountable. If you can't get a social security number, you can't get a social security number. And that is a very difficult barrier. But right now, as we know, in the past several years in our country, there is a lot of movement of immigrants across our southern border. And Sister Patty and I are here in San Antonio, Texas, at a migrant resource center where we are privileged to be able to join with the regular staff of this center who receive immigrants from the border towns of Laredo, Eagle Pass, Del Rio, even as far away as Brownsville and Matamoros. The buses of immigrants come here every day. And every day at this center, there are at least 700 migrants being helped by this center, sponsored by Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of San Antonio. And they are brought here to a sort of central point because there is an airport and a bus station here where they can get transport to the various parts of the United States where their friends and family will be receiving them. And at this center, they receive assistance in making a phone call to family members who buy them their ticket on either the bus or the plane. They get to have an overnight accommodation, to have facilities to take a shower. They get a change of clothing and meals, 3 meals a day, the hot meal being served at lunchtime. And case management, this is one of the critical pieces. There are probably 200 on any given day out of those 700 who do not have a connection in this country. And so they are people who are looking to find a place to go, literally. And this Catholic Charities in San Antonio is working with other agencies throughout the United States, similar to Casa San Jose, that will cooperate in helping to give a reception, a welcome, and some assistance to get settled to these families that are coming with no destination, with no family or friend to receive them. The countries of origin of the persons changes depending upon urgent circumstances. And of course, right now, many of the people coming are from Venezuela, because Venezuela's political, they tell me, the people coming tell me that it doesn't matter if you have money, there is no food to be had in Venezuela. So hunger is one of the big problems there. Another story I've heard as I get to talk to people here in this center is that Mexican police, Mexican immigration authorities will actually take their money from them. They will actually say to them, unless you give me 1,000 pesos, I'm not going to pass you on to this next step on your journey. So they and I believe them. So everybody's taking from them. They're very, as Karen Gonzalez says, this is a very, very vulnerable population, and they go through a very dangerous journey in order to get to our border, and then they go through the process, if our government will permit them, to enter to seek asylum. Any of the persons that come to this migrant resource center here have been given permission to seek asylum in this country. They have to show those papers when they present themselves here at this migrant resource center. So they have been given permission to seek asylum. But as we see at Casa San Jose every day, and as Karen Gonzalez said, the process to seek asylum is a very, very long and expensive process. There are not many free pro bono lawyers. You have to work under the table because, of course, you have to work in order to survive. And the courts are very highly backlogged. And even after that number of years, you may not be granted asylum. So the process really needs a concerted effort on part of our Congress, which our Congress seems incapable of setting themselves to the task of really reforming immigration law so that it meets the circumstances of today's reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sister. And thank you. We know that you're in San Antonio, Texas right now. You've been there for quite a while, helping these people every single day. And then in addition to all of the wonderful work that you do here in Pittsburgh for migrants, just thank you so much. Sister Janice is the founder of Casa San Jose, and I have had the pleasure of learning from her and working alongside her for a little under 10 years now. The passion that she brings to this work really helps help us continue to do the work here in Pittsburgh and now along the border. So thank you, sister. So right now, we're going to invite people to ask questions. Okay, we have a question here. Thank you so much. Philomena is asking, first she's thanking you, Karen. And then this is a great question. Could you explain the anti-immigrant arguments that Christians make? Where are these passages in the scripture? Thank you. That's a great question.
Yes. So one of the main ones is that Romans 12, 1 and 2 verse that I shared with you. That's a big one that I heard. In fact, when I worked in legal services, somebody called once and asked me if he had a duty to deport his neighbors because of this verse. So that's the one that people usually pick out as, oh, but the Bible says we should follow the law, that God has placed, leaders in authority. And so I just invite people to consider um, the whole message of the scriptures of people going from strangers to being part of the family of God, from being in bondage to being free, um, and from being outside to being inside family of God. And so we can't just pick out one thing and say, well, this one thing says, without looking at the context of the whole Bible. What does it say about how we are to treat the immigrants in our midst? And so um, that is a big one that people bring up. I also invite people to look at lots of immigrants in the Bible. If you look at people like Abraham migrated to Egypt, there's lots of movement of people because it's a very natural thing for people to move. And people always move in search of resources, in search of, in the Bible, Abraham, there's a famine, so he goes to Egypt. That's what drives Ruth and Naomi to migrate as well. But we see David migrates, fleeing persecution from King Saul, right, who is after him and wants to take his life. There's a lot of movement of people, but you have to have the eyes to see it. It's a very normal thing for people to seek refuge, to seek a better life. Oh, I see another question here.
Yeah. So
Yes.
this question is, after the Vietnam War, the Catholic Church in the U.S. encouraged parishes to sponsor Vietnamese families and be involved in accompanying them here. What role are Christian churches now playing in both welcoming and advocating for comprehensive immigration reform? Another really good. You guys are good with asking questions. Thank you.
Yes. And that was a really effective program after the Vietnam War. And so right now, you can also still sponsor, usually asylum seekers. So they are always looking for sponsors. Usually it's not long term, it's short term. But that is an option now as well. And there are many Christians who are advocating for this comprehensive immigration reform. Now, I want to define for you what that is because I know it looks a little bit intimidating, these words. So I'm going to put up a slide here really quickly for you. This is a comprehensive immigration reform that people are seeking. This is what many Christians are advocating for, and it includes these parts. Number one, it would make it harder to immigrate or work illegally. So it would secure the border and create an enforceable workplace authorization system. So right now, we don't have an enforceable workplace authorization system. So immigrants get penalized for being undocumented, but the people who hire them do not. But if we created an enforceable system for everyone, then we'd have fewer people who are undocumented, right? But number two, make it easier to enter and work lawfully. We have a lot of labor needs. We have more jobs, especially at the lower end, blue collar jobs, than we have people to fill them at the moment. And we also want to keep families together. Tearing families apart is not an American value. And then finally, require people who are here unlawfully to earn legal status. They pay a penalty, they pass a background check, they pay taxes. So when you hear comprehensive immigration reform, this is what we're talking about right here. It is not my dream legislation, I'll be honest with you, but I think it's absolutely practical. It's feasible. I think it's something that both parties could agree on. But I think that our legislators have not had the will to move forward with this. And so that's where we, the people, have to put pressure on them. So part of what we can do, and part of what a lot of Christians are doing, is calling their legislators and asking them about this very piece right here. So that's one thing that people are doing. There are a lot of people that are doing some really good work to, uh, like these groups that are on this call right now. In the group that I was visiting, I visited several shelters in Nogales and in Arizona and also in Mexico. So there are a lot of shelters doing really good work to care for immigrants in need and protecting them because there's so many predators out there when they see that people are vulnerable. And unfortunately, the border creates this kind of culture of people who are on the make and looking for people to take advantage of, people to rob who they know won't report it because they're scared or they don't believe they have recourse. And um, so there's also that good work that's happening. But definitely our system does need something like this. I think it's very possible. We just need to put pressure on our legislators. The people who are anti-immigration, they call a lot. They really put a lot of pressure on our legislators, even with, they don't even have the facts and they just call and complain about immigrants. So I try to call about once a week. I call about different things. Sometimes I say, what's my representative's position on the DREAM Act? I want a legislative solution for dreamers in our country. Why hasn't, what is he doing? What is she doing to push this forward? So that's part of the good work that we can do as well. Put this pressure on our legislators. That's power that we have as citizens. And that's something that immigrants don't have. They don't have an ability to put pressure on legislators in the US. And I think another really good thing for us to do is just to advocate to our friends and family. There's a lot of misinformation about immigration that exists. I think that's really important work to remind people of the fact. And when they say something that is just not true, like, I see sometimes on social media, somebody will say something like immigrants are taking all our jobs. It's not true. We have so many jobs. We don't even have enough citizens to fill them, people of working age to fill them. Or when people say, oh, immigrants, take public benefits and they don't work. And this isn't true either. They're not eligible for public benefits. They're not going to apply for something like that when they're not eligible. Immigrants fear deportation, and so they're not going to make themselves a target by going to a government agency in a language they don't know to ask for public benefits. So I think that's really important local advocacy work that we can do in our communities. But there's also things that people are doing locally with city government. Like I know in my city when I lived in Baltimore, um, we would go to these city council meetings because we wanted to make sure that immigrants could have driver's licenses in Baltimore because you don't want people driving around without a license. That's very dangerous, dangerous for the community, and it's not good for immigrants who need to get to work, right? And so it's a win-win for everyone. So there are other things that locally we can advocate for as well. But yeah, it's very discouraging in the way that things are going, the way that our legislators are just not making any progress in this area.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. I just to add on to some of the things that you were saying, I always encourage people to call their elected officials and talk to them, because you're right, they are hearing the other side. And then, there are people that have never engaged in that and they're a little hesitant. And I just tell them, call after 5 and leave a voicemail. right?
Mhm.
They'll get it. They'll get it. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
and then the other point that you brought up, that these people that we're serving every day don't qualify for public benefits, but they're paying into the systems that
Mhm.
that they'll never be able to access. So thank you. Sister Barbara, I saw your hand.
Yes, I was going to ask that historically, our country, through our policies and actions, have actually caused some of the oppression and suffering of many people in different nations. And I was wondering how we can better create a movement in which we turn that around. That first off, that we as Americans realize our history and that we reconcile from that unfortunate history, and how can we advocate for changes that will assist nations?
Yeah, and that's another really important point that you're making, that there's the sort of micro level issues with immigration, right? And then there's macro level, and that's what drives migration. So I wrote in my book that, I'm here in the United States because the US government funded a civil war in Guatemala. Literally, it started in 1954. They overthrew a democratically elected president because of the pressure from the United Fruit Company that wanted control of the farming land. And they put in a series of military dictators that eventually a civil war broke out because of the repression. And I'm here. I'm here because they were there. And that's the reality that we have to reckon with. We're going to be seeing a lot of Afghan people migrating. Why? Because we were in Afghanistan, right? And these are realities that we as citizens have to reckon with. And I think what we have to really consider as people, right? We're not making these decisions at these levels. However, we are electing our officials, and it's important to find out. One of my fears when Hillary Clinton ran for president is that, one of my fears around her, and I had fears around Donald Trump too, don't get me wrong, more fears that way. But I feared with her, she had a very aggressive foreign policy, and I was afraid, she and under Obama, this drone program that killed a lot of people, that affected a lot of communities. I was very fearful of that because that's part of what drives migration is when we have this aggressive foreign policy where we end up destabilizing other countries. So I think it's something to keep in mind, definitely as we're casting votes for our leaders. I don't know how much control we have personally over that. But what we can do is we can have compassion for the things that are driving this migration. The recent migration from Central America, from El Salvador, from Honduras, from Guatemala, has to do with these gangs that were born in LA, and that these people then are deported. These gang members are created in LA. They're thrown in prison where they become hardened criminals and are able to organize themselves like a mafia almost. And then what do? They come out and they deport them to El Salvador. They deport them to Honduras, to Guatemala. What happens? They reorganize themselves and now they're terrorizing these communities. There are places where people used to have a business and used to be able to live, and then they were being extorted and they were being terrorized in their communities, so they left. And they're seeking, but again, the migration was created by this policy, right, of deporting these people, bringing them back, and not really considering the fact that they were made in the US and now they're wreaking havoc in other countries. So I don't know if you remember when Kamala Harris went to Central America, a lot of people were very upset, a lot of immigration advocates, because what did she do? She told people, do not come. But the thing is, you can't apply for asylum from Guatemala. You have to show up at a port of entry. That's the only way to apply for asylum. So essentially, she was telling people, just stay and suffer, die, be extorted, see your daughters raped, see your sons become, criminals because they're forced into these gangs. I mean, that's no kind of life. And that's why people took that so hard, was because she was essentially telling people that they have no way out of a situation that the United States has created. So I think there's, the most hopeful things that I've seen, because again, I think it's important, the political level and the big picture around immigration, but the most hopeful work that I have seen is on the ground. People who are doing work at the local level. Like, when I just came back last week from Arizona and I went to a shelter in Mexico. A lot of people don't know how much the Mexican church is doing and the Mexican nonprofits are doing to support the immigrants that are coming through. But there's a church that's alive and well there too. Uh, one of the shelters that I support is Casa Migrante in Tijuana, and it's a Catholic um, shelter for deportees, but it's a very dignifying space. It's clean. They have social workers. Um, they have therapy for people. They have medical care for people that are deported. Help them to encourage them to stay in Mexico, to not take on this dangerous journey again. I met people in Nogales that are medical examiner working to identify bones of migrants that die in the desert so they can return the bodies to their families back in Central America, which is a great comfort in our communities. I mean, this is where I think I really see, you know, uh, the hands and feet of Jesus, where people are really doing this kind of work. Um, because it can be very discouraging if we're just looking at what's the government doing? Are we passing this act or that? Um, and there are a lot of people making a difference in the circle that they have, to protect and care for the immigrants in their midst in their communities. There was a church in Baltimore where I lived until recently. And it's a Lutheran church. It was a very white community, and the neighborhood around them changed over the years, and it's mostly now Hondurans and Salvadorans that live in this neighborhood. And instead of being resentful, like a lot of people are, they become resentful of the changes of the neighborhood. I was really proud of the way that the church has handled all the changes in the community. During the pandemic, they just went to their neighbors. They had this kind of outdoor gathering because of the pandemic and, not wanting anybody to get infected with COVID. And they just said, what can we do to support you? We have some resources in the church. Do you need a food pantry? Like, what do you need for us as a church? And people said, what we want is we need internet so that our kids can do homework during the day because they're working, they're going to school from home. And a lot of people didn't have Wi-Fi for their kids to keep doing their schooling. So the church created this space, with social distance, tables in order to serve the community. And, a lot of those kids now are a part of that church because of the way that they were welcomed into this space. And, the parents still don't go. The parents still go to the local Catholic church because that's what's familiar to them and that's their faith heritage. And that's a good thing, But I think we can do a lot at a local level. And I think this is where a lot of us need to put our eyes and our focus.
Thank you so much. I have um, uh, a comment and then one final question. I'll go with the comment first. So the comment says, um, when I'm engaged with someone who complains about immigrants at the border and insists that they should be pushed back, I always say, wonder how many are trained in nursing. Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that, Mary. And then the final question that we have is, how will climate migration affect the situation?
Yeah, so that's already a reality that's happening. And there are people studying it. So what's happening is it's not affecting, the people who are middle to upper class in other countries, but the poor are really being affected, the people who live close to the land. So when I was in Guatemala last summer, Guatemala has a lot of highlands and a lot of coffee is grown there. But what farmers are seeing is that they're needing to plant higher in order to produce the coffee crop because of the way that the land is changing. And so that is a real concern. The coffee growing regions of Guatemala, which is like Huehuetenango, they're seeing the most migration out. And we're going to see more droughts and more changes to the land that are negative, more pests, more of these, lack of uh, like the seeds changing. There's a lot of, I just read a whole book about this by an environmental scientist, and it's a very serious concern. But again, it's mostly for people who are very poor. They are the people who live closest to the land and are very poor are being the most affected by that. And we're already seeing that.
Thank you so, so much. And thank you, everyone. This is a great discussion. Those are some really great questions. And just thank you, Karen, so much for all of your insight. We'd like to extend another minute or so to Karen to give us some closing remarks to kind of close us out this evening.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me. A lot of times when I speak about immigration, people ask me, what gives you hope in this conversation when there's so many things happening that seem to be so negative, so harmful to immigrants. But what gives me hope is spaces like this, when you have given up your evening to gather here to learn about this, or maybe to reinforce, what you already knew, but to gather in this space in solidarity, because we care about the well-being of all God's children and of migrants in this case. And so this is very hopeful for me, and I'm very thankful that you welcome me into this space.
We're very, very grateful to have you. Thank you so, so much.